I'm Eric Eisner. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah,
Yes.
great. Terrific. All right. I'm Eric Eisner, and on behalf of the Keats-Shelley Association, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's virtual event. Our goals for these virtual events are to provide a space for connections among romanticists and those interested in romanticism around the globe, and to offer a platform for exciting projects on interesting and timely topics in romanticism. So we're very pleased to be able to host today's roundtable, The Unruly Clock, on the always timely topic of time, organized by Professor Jerónimo Ledesma of the Universidad de Buenos Aires, where he's a professor of 19th century literature and research secretary of the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters. Jerónimo has translated Mary Shelley and Thomas de Quincey, among others, into Spanish, and he runs the series Romanticismos Traducidos. With Professor Carolina Ramallo, who also joins us today. He co-directs an ongoing research project at UBA on modes of temporality in 19th century literature. And what I think is very cool, today's roundtable includes participants in this exciting collaborative project at various levels, faculty, doctoral students, advanced undergrads even. So in a moment, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Jerónimo. But before I do, I want to make two very quick announcements. So first, our next virtual event is in just a few weeks. Our annual members meeting, May 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're very excited to have a talk by Nicholas Rowe of the University of St. Andrews, celebrating Nick's new book, Keats and the Perils of Posterity. He'll speak on Byron, Hunt, and the Liberal, Friendship, Fallout, and Liberal Ideals. So non-members are very welcome to attend, of course, and perhaps you'll take the opportunity to find out more about the KSAA and what we do and consider becoming a member. And you can also do that by going to our website, ksaa.org, and you'll find the event page for that there. Second, two very quick housekeeping notes. First, if everybody could make sure to mute themselves so we can hear the roundtable uninterrupted. And also, I want to emphasize that part of the richness of today's talk or roundtable comes from the translinguistic as well as transnational character of the roundtable and the gathering here, as well as of the materials that we'll be discussing. So the proceedings will be mostly in English, but we'll make space for movement between languages via translation so that we can make sure everybody can participate fully. Um, and so I'll turn things over to Jerónimo. Thank you so much for organizing this, and please take it from here.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Eric. Now I will share the presentation and start with the reading. But first of all, I would like to thank the Keats-Shelley Association of America for the kind invitation to this series, the digital events. And we are particularly thankful to Kate Singer and to Eric here. So your encouragement and your help was a lot. So thank you. Um, well, now we are going to share. Let me make the technological shift here. Okay. Okay. You are see it okay? Seeing it okay? Mm. Well, um, first an introduction of ourselves. We, the so-called speakers, are a group. Here we are, a group of Spanish-speaking scholars from Latin America, Carolina, Pablo, Cecilia, Mario, Daniela, Gabriel, Juan, and me, Jerónimo, and we study European literature of the long 19th century with a particular focus on works written in non Hispanic languages. We study these literatures in their own right and also in relation to those of the American continent. We teach in Spanish and we translate into Spanish. We work at the Universidad de Chile, the Universidad de Buenos Aires, the Universidad de Hurlingham, que le decimos Hurlingham, we say Hurlingham here, and the National Council of Science and Research called CONICET. And in this way, we modestly account for the unusual uses of English that may arise in this panel. Well, the Unruly clock, el reloj insumiso. The title of this roundtable is a coin name, a playful metaphor. With it, we name literature as a cultural technology, not in general, but within a specific conceptual context, which is the consolidation of the biopolitics of modern time. With the term biopolitics, I refer to the power that shapes the conditions of life, regulating labor, sleep, health, reproduction, mobility, and daily rhythms. It operates less through coercion than through normalization of habits, environments, and infrastructures. Temporal technologies are not mere conveniences. They inscribe a social order in bodies, defining some rhythms as normal and others as deviant. The unruly clock, then, names a form of resistance or at least of friction against that kind of normalization. This conceptual context belongs in our work to a certain historical context, the long 19th century. We can say the very long 19th century, indeed, a period stretching from 1750s to 1920. This is the macro periodization of Jürgen Osterhammel. It is a period, as we all know, of capitalist expansion, industrialization, scientific and technological development, bourgeois and workers' revolutions, of imperialism, colonization, wars of independence, the first wave of feminism, and the emergence of new states. And this long period saw the consolidation of a specific temporal regime associated with bourgeois capitalism. We call it modern time. It is a time defined by linear and secular progress, an experience of acceleration and valorization of the future, and the global synchronization and uniformization of life. This time is embedded in discourses, technological infrastructures, and social practices. The success of this regime, its assimilation as common sense, has often led to picture the entire 19th century and its literature under its key. And of course, the whole history of humankind has been rewritten accordingly. That's why we choose for our flyer a 1938 painting by René Magritte, La durée poignardée, literally, the duration stabbed, usually translated as time transfixed. It offers a striking visual synthesis of these ideas. A bourgeois interior, a train bursting from the fireplace, and on the mantelpiece, deceptively still the true invention of the Industrial Revolution, the clock. Alongside the railway, much more than a vehicle, a complex system that structured transport networks and acted upon the very form of time through the demands of market synchronization. We, the speakers, have a collective project at the university that investigates the role of literature not only of the Romantic literature, but 19th century literature in general, within this conceptual historical context. And we study it as a technology of temporality and as a distinctly unruly one. Let's now spend a few moments on the expression technology of temporality, especially as applied to literature. We use this term for two reasons. First, we take seriously the idea that literature functions like any technology as a human prosthesis, a set of techniques and forms of knowledge that supplement the human, as we can read in, for example, Bernard Stiegler. Second, within the historical context we have outlined, literature actively experimented with different configurations of time, competing sometimes openly, sometimes implicitly, with the temporal devices that establish modern time biopolitically. This gave it an active, even potentially dangerous role to literature. To be sure, literature also contributed to the regimentation of life along the lines of progress, synchronization, and acceleration. Realism, in many ways, accompanied the modern clock. Yet, because of its structural tension with these discourses and its drive toward autonomy, literature tended to operate as an undisciplined or indeed an unruly clock. And this was particularly the case with Romanticism. To illustrate the idea of literature as an unruly clock, one might recall here a novel from the beginning of the long 19th century that was so cherished by Romanticism and, at the end of our period, by the Russian avant-gardist formalists. I am referring to Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne. It was published around the 1760s during the Enlightenment. The clock at the beginning of the novel gives birth to the unruly personality of its narrator. How can we forget the scene in which Tristram's mother suddenly remembers time? She was with the hero's father at the very moment of procreation. There's the quotation. Indeed, we might say, at its culminated instant, at least from the male point of view. And then suddenly she remembered what? She remembered that the clock needed to be wound. For Uncle Toby, that ill-timed interruption would have weighed upon the homunculi, that is, the precursors to spermatozoa, thus producing the most digressive writing subject the world has ever seen, one resistant to linear progression and to planned organization. This unexpected concern for the clock produced, well, literature as an unruly clock. Please take a look at the famous diagrams of its form drawn by Tristram Shandy himself. There at the slide. Certain technologies, mechanical, cultural, or both, were central for the emergence of the regime of modern time. Of course, in the first place, the clock, the object on the mantelpiece in Magritte's painting. And there at the left, you have an image that we can relate to Tristram's clock. What kind of clock was that? The clock in Tristram Shandy was supposedly this one, a long case, month-going clock. While previous devices, clepsydras, you have there at the right a clepsydra from Egyptian culture, sundials, and other ways of measuring time came before the mechanical clock. While temporal discipline itself is ancient, the invention and development of this device was fundamental to the establishment of this new regime of time in everyday life. It became a key infrastructure of industrial modernity, and it was itself a model for the production of other machines. We cannot avoid repeating the dictum of Louis Mumford: the clock, not the steam engine, is the key machine of the modern industrial age. The mechanical clock created the framework of an abstract time capable of synchronizing human action. Unlike its predecessors, this device operated independently of natural conditions and produced the perception of time as a succession of mathematical units. Historically, the development of the mechanical clock is closely tied to the rise of capitalist bourgeoisie. E.P. Thompson, as you may remember, has written some widely quoted pages on how clock measured time imposed a new discipline of labor and a new social norm. The device became fully widespread by the mid-19th century with the systematic production of low-cost clocks and watches associated with the transport of goods by rail and with a new set of regulatory norms. We, now, as users of Google Calendars, Facebook birthday reminders, and satellite maps, can look back at that moment in history as a kind of original transgression. But the mechanical clock was only one key device within a broader development of chronometry as a technological discipline with multiple uses. Calendars, for example, as other complex devices in these fields, we are not going to talk about them. By the end of the 19th century, we witnessed the standardization of time through the adoption of Greenwich meridian as the norm for world timekeeping. In the symbolic construction of the order of time, beyond chronometry, Pomian has shown we must also consider chronology, chronography, and chronosophy. Chronosophy encompasses the systems and practice that represent the future and organize history into a global, coherent trajectory with a defined topology and direction. Chronology is the paradigmatic model of the linear organization of temporality, presenting it as an irreversible succession. I am interested, however, in pointing to the importance of chronography for our period, which underwent radical changes at the beginning of the very long 19th century. Chronography is the discipline devoted to the visual representation of historical time, the one responsible for designing maps of time. And what was the major chronographic invention of this period? The modern timeline. The line with a single axis and a regular distribution of date is indeed an invention that we should date to the 18th century. It served to simplify and communicate the uniformity, directionality, and irreversibility of historical time. The line acquired a new and privileged status, almost an ontological value, which became articulated with the other infrastructures of modern time. Here you have the key works in this field. Jonathan Sacks, in the Poetics of Decline in British Romanticism, has argued that these new chronographic forms were in fact a response, an answer to the temporal complexity of commercial modernity. Timelines would present time as homogeneous and regular precisely because the lived experience of capitalist modernity was heterochronic, of multiple times. We won't continue expanding the inventory of technologies that accompanied the emergence of modern time, entering the topic from this angle rather than through the more usual path of discourse or through the philosophy of history or the ideology of progress, had a didactic purpose. I wanted to emphasize the material, infrastructural, and biopolitical dimensions of this regime, which sometimes seems to exist only in consciousness or in the world of ideas. It also allows us to see that these mechanisms and techniques are not free from representation. On the contrary, they play an important role in producing and organizing it. It also opens the way for us to better understand the role of a cultural technology such as literature, where literature also transforms its practices and techniques during this period in accordance with the direction of modern time. Think in everything that helped shape the new cultural market. At the same time, by virtue of its own technical specificity, it modeled and configured temporal forms that did not have to submit to the demands of modern representation, or that directly opposed them. Literature precisely made it possible to expose the deeply heterochronic character of a period in which a new social order sought to establish a new form of temporality as a universal standard. Romanticism is a specific case in which literature functioned as an unruly clock or technology of time. We could say also as a faulty chronology or an unexpected chronography. This is so because it seems not only to play with time, but to establish in its works a critical relationship with the modern paradigm of time, with its hegemonic symbols and infrastructures, at the very moment of its consolidation. Some years ago, together with Daniela Paulini, she's here with us, we thought of the figure of dislocation as the one that best describes the enormous variety of romantic temporal experiments, starting from the militant inadequacy to the present of its various poetics. The specificity of the romantic laboratory is historical, since it enters into dialogue with the very historical and conceptual context we have been outlining. It is in fact the cultural field through which literature itself becomes temporalized, and in doing so give rise to new forms of writing. This dialogue is highly diverse, drawing on multiple traditions, historical experience. Think, for instance, of the French Revolution, and a wide range of rhetorical and discursive techniques. But certainly, romantic temporal dislocation complicates the regulatory, homogenizing, and accelerationista project of the technologies of modern time. Positions hostile to romanticism long accused it of being escapist. Flight from the world and rejection of the present were the figures most often invoked as signs of its weakness or incapacity. This referred to what? To the vindication of past eras, to lyrical, mystical, or prophetic visions, to the idealization of ruins and nature, to the overrepresentation of emotional subjectivity, among other things. But those very accusations and critiques, we might say, pointed to the way in which Romanticism functioned as a technology of temporality, a dislocated mode, one that relates to the present only through difference with the present, but not one that implies an escape from time or its denial. I would like to conclude with a reference to the relatively recent volume Romanticism and Time, Literary Temporalities, edited by Sophie Laniel Musitelli and Céline Saviron. It is a particularly interesting collective work bringing together diverse perspectives on romantic temporality, from Percy Shelley's spiraled time to John Clare's organic cyclicity, as well as deep time in Charlotte Smith and restorative modes in Wordsworth. The editors argue that romantic time, quote, disseminates itself into widely varying scales, paces, and planes in an age of major transformations. And they just says that this variability in turn corresponds to the heterogeneity of those historical changes. Well, I am going to leave the share presentation. Well, after this introduction, we will hear a series of presentations. I will say just a brief words before each one. First of all, I'm going to present Pablo San Martin Varela, the problem of what romanticism is, and of course, how it should be periodized remains with us. Periodization, after all, is closely tied to the problem of time and its linear structuring, but it often relies on retrospective constructions shaped by prior selections of authors, dates, works, and genres. This has already been the subject of long discussions, and one may ask whether there is a relation between the difficulty of defining romanticism and the problem of how to periodize it. The first of our presentations then would be by Pablo San Martin Varela from the Universidad de Chile, Chile University, and he will propose reconsidering romantic periodization by identifying the 1764 publication of the Castle of Otranto as a foundational epochal event for romantic narrative poetics. Pablo will approach the problem of origins through a work that itself calls originality into question and that inaugurates what Bakhtin termed the chronotype of the castle. So, Pablo, your turn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jerónimo. Let me share my slides. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks to Kate for inviting us and to Eric and Kayla for the ACE organizing work over the past few months. I'm really grateful for the opportunity of collaborating with the Keats-Shelley Association, along with colleagues at the University of Buenos Aires, from the quirky inland island that is Chile. Today, I want to try out an idea that has been haunting me for some years. One I am just beginning to explore. It involves rethinking the origins of Romanticism from the point of view of narrative poetics and the history of the novel. At a recent roundtable on a similar topic, Fiona Stafford approached the vexed question of romantic origins through the prism of nationhood in the British Isles. That is, from the point of view of the four nations. As you can see, the starting point she considers for England and Scotland are inextricably bound with the ballad revival and the conception of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, to quote Wordsworth's famous phrase. In this way, the origins of literary romanticism can be pushed back from lyrical ballads at the turn of the century to poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect a decade and a half before, all the way to the Ossian poems of the early 1760s. Moving from the lyric to the novel, of course, also involves considering the well-known gendering of genre that took place during this period. I have always found it difficult not to read this sentence by Mary Shelley as an ironic comment on the literary inclinations of male writers, including her husband-to-be and Lord Byron. The illustrious poets, annoyed by the platitude of prose, speedily relinquished the uncongenial task of writing a ghost story. That is. In considering the Castle of Otranto as yet another beginning for English Romanticism, the key idea that I want to highlight is that Walpole proposes to distinguish between two levels on which the principle of probability can be applied. He basically says that novelists are free to choose the laws of they are free to choose the laws that rule the fictive world, but should observe strict psychological realism in the behavior, emotional responses, and language of their characters. That is, the imagination is allowed to run wild in the nature of the world, but not in human nature. The argument for this literary choice in the second version of the preface is that it affords more interesting situations, not just to entertain the reader, but to explore human nature through imaginary contexts and incidents that go beyond the boundaries of modern romance, or what we would today call the realist novel. This is why I see Otranto's prefaces as the first programmatic statement or manifesto for what we today call speculative fiction. a narrative macro-genre that encompasses not only the Gothic and horror, but also modern fantasy and science fiction. This idea resurfaces half a century later in the preface to the first edition of Frankenstein, where the Shelleys put the authorial voice in paradoxical straits. They deny believing in the scientific hypothesis of the vital principle, while at the same time claiming that the novel that follows is not a mere tale of specters and enchantment. They say they have endeavored to preserve the truth of the elementary principles of human nature, now exploring them through counterfactual situations that afford, quote, a point of view to the imagination for delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding, unquote, than those of common life. So narrative provides a way of exploring the human mind and behavior through imaginative events, situations, or worlds, serving as a medium to arrive at truth and increase our stock of knowledge about human nature. But Walpole's prefiguration of romantic narrative poetics does not end here with the Gothic and science fiction. I claim that we can also see in the Castle of Otranto, the origins of the historical novel. One of the strategies Walpole employs to justify the use of supernatural elements is that they make the narrative faithful to the manners of the times. It doesn't matter, he says, whether the author believes in such things as miracles, but they should faithfully portray what people believed in the period in which the story is set. Thus considered, perhaps the word Gothic in the subtitle refers not to the setting of the story, a story set in the Middle Ages, but also to its storytelling. The Castle of Otranto is a story told in the manner of medieval romance, reconstructing the worldview of the narrator, as well as the manners of the characters. This brings me briefly to the dedicatory epistle to Ivanhoe, where Walter Scott felt the need to vindicate his novel to prevent its being classed with the idle novels and romances of the day. For him, the key once again lies in how the intermingling of fiction and truth is to be achieved and understood. Ivanhoe purports to portray the private and domestic life of our ancestors, providing a striking contrast between the manners of old Saxons and Normans, especially with regard to their habits and sentiments. In other words, it is a novel that aims to reconstruct things for which we have very little evidence, imagining how people must have felt, thought, and acted in their everyday lives under historical circumstances imperfectly known through fragmentary records. And to finish, finally, I'd like to highlight Scott's explicit acknowledgement of a common literary lineage. He mentions Walpole as a fellow antiquarian who was able to write a good novel, admittedly a goblin tale and not a historical romance. But the point still stands. Scott took pains to have the title of his materials printed in the black letter or Gothic script, as you can see in the last quotation here, the Wardour manuscript, just like the old Italian manuscript Walpole originally claimed to have translated. That is everything for now. I'd be happy to hear any comments or suggestions or discuss any of the quotes I rushed through in more detail.
Thank you, Pablo. That was great. We are going to leave the questions for the end of the row of presentations. Now, I want to say that one of the questions that we have been exploring in this in our project across the whole century has to do with the tensions that emerge at the intersection between models of modern temporality and sexual gender. Clearly, the unruly character of Romanticism, its challenges to linear time, does not exempt it from the contradictions of patriarchal culture. Carolina Ramallo from the Universidad of Hurlingham and Buenos Aires will bring a cross-cutting gender perspective to analyze romantic temporality as a gendered technology. She has been working for some time on this complex and not self-evident way of introducing gender as an epistemological question and as a matter of cognitive justice in the study of literature. So, Carolina, your turn.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. In this brief presentation, I would like to share the foundation of my work on the inclusion of gender perspective in 19th century literary studies with a special focus on the Romantic period. My proposal does not seek to treat gender as an isolated subject or quota for female authors, but rather as a cross-cutting and methodological perspective that permits both research and university teaching. I draw on a critical and feminist pedagogy that aims to an exercise of cognitive justice, recognizes forms of knowledge that have historically been rendered invisible by the modern masculinist and feminist gaze. To approach the study of Romantic literature from this perspective, I propose 4 strategies. 1. The rediscovery of female authors and the analysis of their role as intellectual. It's vital to examine the work of pioneer women, such as the thinkers, writers, and translators of the Vienna Romantic movement in Germany. Madame Stael, who introduced German Romanticism to France, and Mary Shelley and her canonical work Frankenstein in England. The aim of including them in to correct the entrenched notion that women writers were isolated cases of a little relevance in a male-dominant literary works. 2. The deconstruction of patriarchal imagination. It is crucial to draw on a feminist theoretical literature to analyze how 19th century culture consolidates pioneers such as reason, masculinity, and emotion, femininity. Even though the study of romantic sources shows that the extraction of sexualized hierarchical binary pairs was not a fixed position in either the practice or the ideas of our writers. The study of Romantic writing reveals counter-hegemonic proposals in this regard, such as the intercambiability of social sexual roles or the prioritizing of emotion and imagination over reason in the private and public lives of the author. 3, an analysis of the circuits of recognition. It is necessary to study how gender identity was associated with the use of certain permitted literary genders and others that were forbidden or strongly discouraged for women, or the use of male pseudonyms to gain access to the publishing market in order to shed light on the association between authorial identity and textual forms in literary circles, a phenomenon that has been termed the genderization of gender. 4, the political genealogy of feminism. It is highly fruitful to analyze political documents emerging from the revolutionary debates of the Romantic period, such as Mary Wollstonecraft's application of rights women with extractor on political and moral subjects, to demonstrate that the demands for equality were early and vigorous, though subsequently silenced. As an example of how these ideas apply to the study of temporality, I will refer to integrative approach applied to primary Romantic sources that challenge modern linear time. The temporality of slowness in relation to the market. In Dorothy Wordsworth's diaries, one can discern temporalities of interruption or postponement of feminine desire, or the experience of dynastic temporalities for the care work or public participation. We also observe a reading strategy that posits a privileged epistemological position vis-a-vis nature, while modern masculine time accelerates under the logic of commerce and the press in time. Dorothy's writing model a slow and attentive temporality that functions as a resistance to the proliferation of the era's culture's noise. And in second place, the interruption and collapse of future in Mary Shelley. When reading Frankenstein, in addition to encouraging a trans-temporal work, that challenge modern linear time, we can observe an exploration of the collapse of the future envisioned by the Enlightenment and the revolutionary generation. The structure of the novel shows how the desire for creation is interrupted by the catastrophic consequence of a masculine rationality that ignores the ethic of care, transforming utopia into a temporality of mourning and anachronism. When the Romantic movement stage returns to significant sites of the past, historical or natural location, to emphasize a critical and constructive return, it's shaping our understanding of the present in light of the past. And what is remarkable is that occurs not only in relation to history or personal history, but also to literature history. The uses of past literary genres in themes, the Gothic, the scholarly novel, the genres and rhetoric of classical literature has been a privileged romantic mechanism for writing and producing a literary space in which to inscribe ourselves. In closing, I would like to point out that the understanding 19th century literature as a technology of temporality from a gender perspective allow us to hear the voices that from the past still challenge our present, which has their future, in order to change our own. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Thank you. It was great. It's common when dealing with Jena Romanticism, early German Romanticism, to focus on the text of the male writers, such as Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis, and indeed works like Hymnen an die Nacht, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, or Lucinde are sufficiently unruly from a temporal perspective, and as has already been noted, one can read in the lyrical and narrative experiments of Jena a kind of temporalization of consciousness. But Cecilia Dominguez, an advanced undergraduate student and research fellow at the University of Buenos Aires, will present us a less explored female figure from this group, from Jena's group, Caroline von Günderrode. She will analyze the ways in which Günderrode re-evaluates the relationships between past, present, and future in her dialogical prose. Cecilia, now your turn.
Okay, thank you. My intervention aims to further our understanding of Romanticism as a technology of temporality through a reading of Caroline von Günderrode, significant or relatively underread author of German Romanticism. In this brief presentation, I shall touch upon only a few aspects of the conceptual landscape of what is known as Jena Romanticism in relation to temporality, in order to contextualize the contribution of this imperative. German Romanticism has often been interpreted as a field rich in experiments, fragments, and condensations of cultural reflection of time. Among others, Manfred Frank, in his classic book, Das Problem Zeit der deutschen Romantik, The Problem of Time in German Romanticism, explores how a particular experience of time and what he calls temporalization of self-consciousness underpins the metaphysical project of Romanticism. Ingrid Oesterle, for her part, describes Romanticism as the first German literary generation to grow up immersed in a transformation of temporal concepts and terminology, an aspect that is crucial for our approach. Rooted in a key historical moment of reformulation of temporal notions, German Romanticism was thus the forge of a new conceptual vocabulary that involved both philosophy and literary discourse. It is within this conceptual constellation that I propose a reading of two short texts by Caroline von Günderrode, a writer born in 1780 and a problematic figure in literary history due to the frequent reduction of her work to her tragic biography. What proves problematic is not only her suicide in 1806, but also her displacement from the Romantic generation, her wide-ranging affiliation to her work, and the conditions under which her texts appeared. For instance, the use of made pseudonyms and the posthumous publication of significant writings. All of these encompassed, of course, by the problematic issue of female authorship as analyzed by Jerónimo. The two selected prose texts, Die Mannen ein Fragment, The Mains Fragment, and Briefe zweier Freunde, Letters from Two Friends, belong respectively to her first and last compilations, Gedichte und Fantasien from 1804 and Melete, meant to be published in 1806 but edited a whole century later in 1906. In these texts, we can identify a literary reflection on time in which the categories of past, present, and future intertwine and acquire new qualities. Both texts have a dialogical structure, and this is why concepts and arguments not appear in a univocal manner, but rather as polemical and richly nuanced. In the first text, a master and a disciple engage in a dialogue about the possibility of accessing the past, of returning to a glorious ancient time that stands in contrast to the present, described as an insipid and empty age. The figure that here encodes this desired relationship with the past is that of the mains, which are the spirits of the dead drawn from Roman religion. Throughout the text, however, what initially appears to be a conventional lament for a lost past gives way to a potential revivification of it through an active, creative memory, as well as through the intense effects that the past exerts on the remembering subject. Echoing the thought of an author greatly admired by Cavallis, antiquity becomes here an accessible material that can be made present again by the and reworked by the subject's inner sense. This inner sense, conceived as the soul's deepest and finest organ, emerges as a primary vector of temporality, since it not only connects present and past, but also enables the gift of prophecy, which is no other than a sense for the future and for the necessary though invisible links between time periods. In the second text, the epistolary dialogue between two friends returns to the reflection on the contrast between past and present, this time in relation to a judgment on ancient and mythical art deemed mighty and contemporary art deemed insubstantial. Both friends then subject their current historical situation to a diagnosis, to an assessment of its symptoms, in order to determine whether it is healthy or not. These are the terms that they use. Yet the initial distribution of values, the past as grand and the present as diminished, is once again disrupted since, as one of the friends argues, an age can only be measured within the total succession of times, which is by principle infinite, and whose future outcome, perhaps fortunately, remains unknown. In this case, then, there is no survival of the past in the present, but rather a vindication of the uniqueness of each age and consequently of its artistic form. Both texts thus critically counterpose representations of the past, the present, and the future, rendering them more permeable and lending them as well a new readability. To conclude, I would like to leave you with a few words from this latter text, from Briefe zweier Freunde, Letters from Two Friends, words that, insightful as they were regarding the newly born 19th century, that is, Winterrede's present, may also prove so regarding our own. These words also convey an interesting literary image of time and of our relationship with it. So these words are, only that which we can survey takes shape for us, yet we are encompassed by this time as embryos are by their mother's womb. What then can we meaningfully say about it? Thank you.
Excellent, Cecilia. Muchas gracias. Great presentation and a really interesting character. Well, Romanticism was not a passive receiver of temporal changes, but rather an active agent in the configuration of time, a productive technology of temporalities, as we argued. What we call romantic dislocation in the context of the emergence of modern time has functioned for posterity as a discursive tradition, what that has been repeatedly taken up and rewritten. Mario Rucabado Rojas, a PhD candidate researching the reception of English romantics in Argentina, will speak about one of these cases. In his intervention, he will analyze Julio Cortázar's intuitive identification with John Keats in his major posthumous book, Imagen de John Keats Image, written in the mid-20th century. He will show how this well-known Argentine writer composed this critical biography while echoing in his own method Keats' ideas of temporality. Your turn, Mario. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerónimo. Good afternoon to all. One moment. So to take a brief detour into the 20th century, the mid-20th century specifically, I want to briefly discuss Julio Cortázar's biographical essay, Imagen de John Keats. Cortázar would eventually become one of the most celebrated Latin American novelists after publishing Hopscotch, Rayuela in 1963. But in 1951, he was only 37 years old, had just published his first book of short stories, Bestiario, and was very much a literary unknown. As proof of this anonymity, he was not able to publish Imagen, which he wrote in 1951-1952, until during his life, and the book remained in manuscript form until 1996, well after his death. Cortázar rated Keats above all other poets in any language. He professed his love for Keats throughout his life. No other poet made him write so much, starting with a critical essay on the Ode on a Grecian Urn, published in 1946. After that, he translated Lord Houghton's Life and Letters of John Keats, and finally wrote Imagen, his longest manuscript to that point in his life, between 1951 and 1952, as I said. Imagen de John Keats, an image of John Keats, one could translate the title, is the first book written in Spanish on Keats. It is an experimental biographical essay where Cortázar blends literary criticism and theory with biographical narrative, autobiographical anecdotes, poetic prose, and poetry, both original and translated, in English and Spanish. One moment, Cortázar is engaging in a thorough reading of Endymion. The next, he imagines Keats walking around the Buenos Aires suburbs. His goal is not a faithful reconstruction of Keats' life, but rather to bring Keats into the 20th century. Since we are here to discuss literature as a technology of temporality, a technology which allows us to bend and twist linear clock time into something else, this operation is what I want to highlight, especially because what Cortázar does mirrors quite closely what he thinks Keats does in his Ode on a Grecian Urn. Let us first go to his 1946 essay. Here, Cortázar sketches a brief history of modern European attempts to connect with the heritage of Greek antiquity. He contends that 17th and 18th century neoclassicism was, though necessary historically, was mostly a superficial engagement with the Greek spirit, since purely formal aspects of specifically 5th century Attic literature were turned into rigid guidelines for literary production. For Cortázar, true Hellenism belongs to the Romantic era, with Friedrich Hölderlin in Germany and Keats and Shelley in England. These authors are able to connect with the spirit of the ancient Greeks through intuitive identification. Instead of trying to follow a rigid set of rules, they produce analog recreation of Greek values. These poets experience a spiritual coexistence, which Cortázar also links to the political struggles of the revolutionary age. In opposition to the aristocratic Hellenism of the previous centuries, now the essence of Greek art is linked to human freedom and self-realization of the poets. If we now return to Imagen, Cortázar performs a similar operation. Instead of taking a detached academic outlook, he talks of Keats as an elder brother and focuses on what he feels is most alive in the poet. He performs an intuitive identification in order to reach this analog recreation. There is, however, an important difference between Cortázar's type of conjuring versus the one he claims Keats practices. The Ode on a Grecian urn is an ekphrasis, a verbal description of an imaginary urn where Keats projects several scenes that evoke themes taken from Greek art. Keats had frequently visited the Elgin marbles in the British Museum and drew upon them in order to fashion his poem. In Cortázar's analysis, he emphasizes the suspended temporality of the scenes, where, as you surely remember, the bold lover can never kiss his beloved, no matter how near they may be, and the trees will never shed their leaves. Cortázar phrases it thus: to freeze the moment, movement, action, desire, drama, without poetically petrifying it, preserving its fleeting grace, which, precisely because it is fleeting, is grace, and to achieve the poetic miracle of an eternal moment, such is the purpose around which Keats brings together the visual theme, the spiritual resonances that arise from it, and the verse itself that unites them both. Keats performs a poetic miracle, turning the ephemeral into the eternal without losing its fleeting aspect. The scenes in the urn are eternal, but the perspective is not that of a god. They are not seen sub specie eternitatis. Rather, they maintain something of their specificity and individuality. They are still alive, even if they are frozen in time. That being said, Cortázar also highlights the heightened spiritualization of Keats's poem. It is a work of art which takes as its subject another work of art, even if an imaginary one, and the gradual refinement that this implies takes the reader into the rarefied air of the unheard melodies, the ditties of no tone. In this view, Keats reaches the ultimate ambition of art, the frontier where it is freed from sense and music requires no sound. I want to argue that in Imagen, Cortázar takes the first part of what I just described, the intuitive identification with his subject, and forsakes the second, the eternal moment. For what he aims to do with Keats is not to understand him and then freeze him, but rather the opposite, to unfreeze him, to bring him back to life. One could almost say his goal is some sort of time travel. By speaking of the past in the language of the present, as he defines his project, the book allows Keats to walk around mid-20th century Buenos Aires as if he were Cortázar's contemporary. Cortázar states his goal thus: I walk arm in arm with Keats, a more natural way to get to know him than the other, all too common approach, in which the poor man is hoisted up onto a cloud, while the critic piles up tables and chairs to build himself a platform that wasn't the least bit necessary. He is not aiming for bronze or marble, but rather for flesh and bones. His Keats is no idol, no rigid statue, but instead fully human. He often compares him favorably with Shelley, who for Cortázar was too preoccupied with abstract thoughts and political ideals. Cortázar's Keats is above all an artist, but an artist with both feet planted firmly in the ground. One could argue that what Cortázar reads as spiritualization in Keats's Ode is transformed into a sort of militant aestheticism, where the absolute measure of a poet is to submit to his poetry, reduce everything to it, become it, as he says in the prologue. Thus, Cortázar identifies with Keats through his intuition and performs his analog creation. And just like Keats' Ode brings back the spirit of the Greeks in defiance of history and linear time, his experimental book attempted to bring back the romantic spirit in a time and place where Cortázar judged it to be sorely lacking. Thank you very much.
Very, very good. Very nice, Mario. Muchas gracias. And now we are going to the last intervention. And I will begin. Let me share. This is okay, and maybe it has some mistake. Let me see. Here we are. Well, Thomas de Quincey is usually associated with several things: drugs, dreams, murder, strange erudition, classical culture, political economy, the late poets Kant, Joan of Arc, limitless memory, style, prose poetry, and Jorge Luis Borges. However, he is rarely connected with time. I would like to focus on this brief talk on a claim that challenges that absence. My argument is that De Quincey's prose can be understood as a form of romantic experimentation with time in literature. His engagement with time is fundamental. It is not only thematic or philosophical, but structural, shaping his prose across different levels. To begin, I will briefly present a few temporal loci that help outline places that help outline the topic. First, the last days of Kant. The pastiche based on Vasiansky's memoirs and other sources. We may call this a text on the conflict between clock and chronology. It is clear that De Quincey's handling of his source intensifies the contrast between two forms of time, the cyclical time of routine and health, and the irreversible timeline of aging, illness, and death. The first is the time of clock, an alienated eternity made of measured repetitions, while the second is the chronological unfolding of human life itself. In this sense, the text stages a conflict between mechanical time and mortal time in a symbolical killing of Kant. Second, we should turn to Confessions of an English Opium Eater, the paradigm of drugged texts. It's not my category, drugged texts. Kant stands behind this text as a major, though contested figure. Other important figures include Wordsworth, Coleridge, Piranesi, and David Ricardo. After all, Confessions narrates the transformation of what we may call a natural-born scholar. De Quincey is a scholar from the cradle, an Enlightenment subject into another kind of subject, the English opium eater. We could call him the romantic subject. When the text explains how opium transforms the physical and mental economy of this subject, producing what we might call a bio-psycho-poetics of dreams, it focuses on two central dimensions, space and time, precisely the categories which in Kant are a priori and universal forms. These are the unruly rules of a new kind of literature expressed in dreams. We can call this literature romantic. Third, let's take a look at the strange text known as the System of Heavens, as revealed by Lord Rosse telescopes. Also largely a pastiche, it engages with astronomical time, though its scientific discourse is unsettled by literary framing. The text opens with a translation of Kant's essay on the age of the earth and closes with a translation of Jean-Paul Richter. While Kant represents an early contribution to what we now call deep time, Jean-Paul offers a nihilistic vision of infinite space. Between these poles, the text constructs a temporal line that suggests not progress, but a dark revelation. From these examples, especially opium and the telescope, we can formulate two further propositions. First, in De Quincey, literature consciously assumes a temporal biotechnological function that is anti-modern, in a tense dialogue with the machines of the 19th century. including the clock and the railway. Second, this function is closely related to his political, philosophical, and religious position. That is, his conservative Christianity. The design of these biological machines is therefore anti-enlightenment and explicitly Christian. The telescope reveals a fractured, sublime cosmos, while opium appears as an inhuman force that transforms imagination. Let's add another locus. I have it there. The English Mail Coach. This text brings together all the elements of temporal drama, autobiography, biography, history, war, and death. Its central figure is the mail coach, an imperial vehicle that de Quincey opposes to the railway, while also redefining it as a vehicle of revelation. A famous episode slows time almost to a standstill, recalling Zeno's paradox. In the narration, you remember that scene, of a near collision between the mail coach and the small carriage. What is being represented here? Well, explicitly, the temporality of sin and the fall. The text that most clearly makes time a structural principle is Suspiria de Profundis, the late continuation of Confessions. This is also an explicitly Christian text. Its opening describes modern life as shaped by technical progress and its effects on social life, which undermine the capacity of dreaming. De Quincey speaks of a, quote, fierce condition of eternal hurry that weakens human potential. He proposes either slowing down life, and he says we cannot do that, or opposing dominant temporal forces. In this context, he introduces another kind of machine, the, quote, machinery for dreaming planted in the human brain, a kind of biocamera obscura, we can say. The language becomes explicitly technological, as he describes the dreaming organ as a magnificent apparatus that forces the infinite into the chambers of the brain and projects reflections from eternity onto the mind. End of quote. The brain, in turn, functions as a biotechnological writing system. Suspiria develops the well-known analogy between the brain and a palimpsest, where all experiences are stored in successive layers connected by what De Quincey calls involutes. This model suggests a stratified temporality closer to geology than to linear time. Most importantly, the past can return because it is never erased, only overwritten, and in this sense, the brain functions as an unruly clock. Well, there are many other points we could add, since time is in fact a central dimension of De Quincey's literary experimentation, including the constant practice of digression, fragmentation, and analogy, which produces a labyrinthine style reminiscent of Stern and a non-linear reading experience. But we will leave that for another occasion. Thank you. Well, we have arrived to the end of the presentation, of the interventions. So Eric, maybe now you can conduct the rest of the meeting for question and answers and any dialogue that can arise.
Thank you. That was terrific. And yes, so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion among the panelists and for anybody in the audience.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the Keats-Shelley Association of America for hosting this event and to congratulate my colleagues for the insightful presentations. As some of the presents know, in my research, I work on cultural encounters between Great Britain and Argentina in the early 19th century. And one of my main focuses is the problem of periodization. These encounters took place during Britain's Romantic period, but in what could be described as a pre-Romantic moment in Argentina, when neoclassicism was still the predominant aesthetic form. In my doctoral work, I asked whether cultural practices, discourses, and sensibilities associated with Romanticism may have had an earlier impact in the Rio de la Plata region through the ties forged between Britons and Creoles. In doing so, I seek to revisit these differences in periodization and to challenge the notion of needing chronology in the development of Romanticism in transatlantic contexts. So I said that to introduce my question, to comment specifically on Pablo and Mario's presentations, which in my view address the issue in different but complementary ways, as they both let us see how malleable the start and end points of romantic chronologies might be. On the one hand, Pablo traces the emergence of romantic narratives, poetics back to Walpole, and this way he pushes the origin of Romanticism further into the 18th century. And Mario, on the other hand, shows how Cortázar reactivates Keats' poetics in the 20th century, projecting romantic temporality forward by bringing the point into a contemporary framework. So my question is, I would like to ask both Pablo and Mario whether these shifting boundaries may be taken to confirm that Romanticism is a mode of thinking that inherently unsettles its own temporal limits, and in doing so, calls into question the stability of chronological frameworks in a more broad sense. Thank you.
Pablo, you want to go first? Okay.
You go, Mario.
I can think of two ways. Thanks for the question, Danny. I can think of two ways of answering that. One would be to perhaps say that there is something that is intemporal in Romanticism, some sort of a historical essence which can be found in different time periods. I am emotionally partial to this view, but it would not be really very scientific or very rigorous to say something of the sort. So I will refrain from asserting a trans-historical Romanticism and instead opt for the slightly less scandalous argument that perhaps all modern literature is romantic in its essence, in spite of its very stringent efforts to renege on that origin. In Cortázar's case, we would have to point out that he actually believed, and he was not alone in this, that surrealism, among other of the avant-garde movements of the 20th century, had an origin in Romanticism. We could also remember that André Breton actually spoke of surrealism being like the last iteration of Romanticism in a way. So yes, I would say that Romanticism never really went away in Western literature up to perhaps today, to this very day, although contemporary literature is not my forte, but I would argue that.
Thanks, Danny and Mario. Just to pick up on the last idea, because we could be discussing this for days, if not weeks and months. The Castle of Otranto is a surrealist novel. We have many accounts of the origins of the novel, but the one given in Walpole's own letters is that he just dreamt of a castle with a giant piece of armor on top of a battlement. So it came out of a dream, and he started just writing in an uninterrupted flow. I'd say that from the point of view of modes of writing and feeling, so aesthetics and poetics more than modes of thinking more in general, what we have to do with, I think, the label Romanticism is related to a particular way of approaching, on one hand, as I said, the ancient rule of probability, and on the other, on a peculiar relationship between poetry or literature and truth. So wherever there is a defense of poesy or of poetry, I think in the face of claims of antiquarians, for instance, as Scott is defending his historical romance, or reasoners and mechanists, as Shelley would say against Peacock, we are dealing with romantic writing. So in that sense, there can be many threads parallel woven in different ways. So one of which could be considering how different literary genres relate to this kind of sensibility or principle.
Right. Thank you. I think I see a hand up for a hand raised from Marco.
Hi.
You want to go
Hi.
ahead? Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I cannot turn on my camera now, but I had been listening very attentively to the presentations, and I appreciate the opportunity of being present here and listening to your great interventions. I had an anecdotal question for Mario. So along with Professor Divya Moy, we have been translating Imagen de John Keats to English, and we have been presenting our translation and our work on the dialogue between Keats and Cortázar. And I just wanted to ask Mario, how popular is this text amongst readers in Argentina nowadays? Or how have you encountered, or if you have presented your research at other venues, how have people responded? Because on our end, for Anglo readers, this is something completely new, but we have been struggling with finding a publisher for the text. So even though there is interest, there isn't enough interest from publishers so that we can make this text available. So I just wanted to compare and see what your experience has been, like bringing this topic of conversation to researchers and academics in Latin America or in Argentina.
I am sorry, Marco. I couldn't quite catch your meaning because of the audio quality. Could you write in the chat the essence of your question? I'm very sorry about this.
Oh no, it's okay. Let me try to rephrase it. Like, what has been your experience bringing your research to other audiences? Is this book popular amongst Latin American readers?
Oh, you mean whether Keats and the other English Romantics are popular subjects of study in the university?
No, specifically Imagen de John Keats, like the Cortázar.
En relación, Mario, en relación con justamente la popularidad que tiene este libro o no, si cómo encontrás dentro de la recepción, digamos, de Cortázar este texto en particular, porque lo están traduciendo y están con ese proyecto.
Exactamente, muchas gracias por la traducción y darme a entender más claramente.
Gracias, Jerónimo, and again, sorry, Marco, I couldn't quite catch it. I couldn't quite catch the meaning. But yes, Imagen is really an one-of-a-kind book, and it requires a very specific kind of reader. Cortázar himself, during part of his life, after he had finished the book, he made a first attempt at publishing it, and afterwards, whenever he thought about it again, he was like, nah, this book is impossible. Nobody really will be interested in this, because it combines both Cortázar's own personal musings on literature with Keats's, with an actual biography, or at least a sort of biography of Keats, and a literary study of his most important poems. So it does require a lot from the reader, because I personally love Keats. So when I approached the book, I was very much aware of what Cortázar was trying to do. But a reader who loves Cortázar for his novels or short stories and who doesn't have too much of an idea regarding Keats would probably feel a bit lost with this book. So it's kind of a book for a very niche book, a book that it's really for those who love very much Keats very much, Cortázar very much, or preferably both, for completists, so to speak, because however, having said that there is a kind of singular book, it was published in a mass paper edition, that actually sold in diary stands and other places, like some 20 years ago, as part of a full collection of Cortázar's writings. So, because Cortázar is such an important writer here in Argentina, it did circulate a bit. But how many people actually read it full or finish it? It's not that many because of its hybrid nature.
Thank you.
That's great. And I'd refer people also to Mario and Olivia have both written on Imagen in the Romantic Circles. I'll put that in the chat too. Like,
yes, I have read that book in the Latin American afterlives of the English Romantics.
Yeah. Oh, it's so fascinating. Okay, Gabriel, you have your hand up, and then we'll go on.
Thank you. And I also want to thank very much to the Keats-Shelley Association for this event, and also congratulations to all the speakers, my colleagues. I would like to make a comment on Carolina Ramallo's work. Carolina's presentation condenses very many strong arguments, like a manifesto. I would like to focus on one, on point 3 of her presentation regarding the analysis of the circuits of recognition. In my doctoral research, I studied a critique of dilettantism in German literature of the Goethe side. Dilettantism, which became a fundamental aesthetic concept in this period, refers to artistic practice that is not professional, but rather pursued as a pastime. Now, I think the meaning and connotation of the concept of dilettantism seem to be clearly differentiated depending on whether it is used to refer to a male or a female writer. In the former case, it functions as a polemical concept opposed to the ideal of artistic autonomy. In the latter, it functions more as a strategy to enable literary production. In fact, in prefaces and letters, many women authors, such as Sophie von La Roche or Sophie Mereau, strategically adopt this discourse, defining themselves as dilettantes who write in the leisure hours left to them by domestic work and child rearing, and who casually publish their texts without artistic pretensions. While men assert their professionalism to oppose the amateur, professionalism in women carries a mark of immorality. It is as if the adoption of dilettantism for these women authors were the price to pay for entering the market, something a male author would never have done in the era of artistic autonomy. So when we consider that the circuits of publication and consecration function differently depending on the author's gender, this also invites us to question the unity of classic aesthetic concepts such as autonomy, professionalism, or dilettantism.
Thank you, Gabriel, your comment, which perfectly illustrates the importance of analyzing publication and recognition circuits from a gender perspective. Your analysis of dilettantism as a gender strategy shows how this perspective is fundamental to understanding both the empirical and the theoretical aspects for our research. Your contribution allows us to add complexity to the concept of genderations of gender by demonstrating that beyond a structured concept, we must recognize the active strategies employed by subaltern subjects to make their own literary production possible. Likewise, by questioning the concept of aesthetics autonomy, we seek a deeper understanding of how male and female authors strategically navigate and negotiate their place within the literary market and the very moment of when autonomy was taking shape. So thank you.
That's great. And I want to we're coming close to the end of our designated time. But I think, we can run over a few minutes. I see there's Juan still has his hand up, so we'll take one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Great.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to make a brief comment and ask a couple of questions regarding the analysis of Cecilia. First, I would like to comment on the way the three temporal categories, past, present, and future, appear in the texts. In your presentation, these categories seem to become intertwined rather than remaining clearly separated. I would suggest that in these texts, temporality is not compartmentalized, but rather imbricated. In the text, I think it was the Manen ein Fragment. Subjective memory appears to function as a point of connection between past and present. Through memory, the past can be revivified and made present again. At the same time, the text introduces prophecy as a projection toward the future. In this sense, memory and prophecy seem to articulate a temporal movement that links past, present, and future. And my second point concerns your characterization of German Romanticism as a birthplace of new conceptual vocabulary, or as you described it, a technology of temporality that involves both literary and philosophical discourse. I was wondering whether there is any specific term or concept used by Caroline von Gründerode that you would highlight in this regard. Related to this, did you notice any displacement or transformation in the meaning of particular concepts or terms in text you analyzed? I would also like to add that one of my research topics concerns precisely the relationship between Vienna Romanticism and classical antiquity. The idea you brought up from Novalis' work, according to which antiquity can be understood as material capable of being made present again and work through the subject's inner sense, is consistent with the thought of the early Friedrich Schlegel, that is, Schlegel in his role as a philologist. Recently, I worked on the translation of a couple of texts related to ancient Greece in which Schlegel constructs the ethos of the researcher, the historian and the philologist who must reconstruct the image of the past solely through the fragments that reaches from it. Although Novalis speaks of the emergency of antiquity before the eyes and the soul of the artist, the process of making past present again could also be extended to the researcher, and why not to the reader of fragments, to those incomplete material from the past that seek a renewed meaning in the present in the hands of the investigator. Thus, we can conclude that there is no compartmentalization of time, but rather an imbrication of a present that reads and interprets the past. That's basically my takeaway from your work, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan, for your comments. The connections you draw between the ways of creatively reworking the past through memory and the philologist's methods of constructing a reinterpretation of the past through fragments strike me as very pleasing. In this text by Gründerode too, by the way, access to the past stems from certain material remnants akin to those of the philologist. The tomb of a great king, the story of his deeds, the great works of ancient times, as they are referred to in these texts. That reflection on temporality returns repeatedly to the problems of and possibilities of representation, as Jerónimo was saying in the beginning. How to represent the dimension of time, and also, as you said, how to provide those incomplete materials with new meanings. Regarding terminology, I do not observe in this text a deliberate semantic shift, but rather a re-evaluation in the form of fictional dialogue of traditional conceptual categories, which at that time were undergoing a transformation and even a reconfiguration within the artistic. In this direction, the elements you highlighted, memory, prophecy, but also the complex inner sense, emerge as crucial notions for problematizing the representation and even the sensory and affective perception of time. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Cecilia. And thank you to all the panelists on this roundtable. This has been amazing. And to those of you who asked such great, informed, and probing questions. It's been such a pleasure to be thinking about time in so many multifaceted ways with you all, and to be introduced to so many things that now I'm hoping to have the time to go back and read again, or discover anew. So this has been wonderful, and again, I can't thank you all enough. So just one last round of applause for everyone. And again, please, if you can, make it to our members meeting, May 15th, featuring Nick Rowe. And also Omar, who I think had to go, asked me to let everybody know in the fall, in November, we've got a stage reading of Shelley's The Cenci, sponsored by the Red Bull Theater in New York, that we're going to have global watch parties for that. So hopefully people can participate, in South America or wherever you are. So please keep an eye out for that as well. And again, thank you to everyone. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Eric. It was wonderful being here. And well, we are following all the news of the association. So thank you very much.
Terrific. All right.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Bye.
Have a wonderful weekend.
The same for
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.
And thanks. Yeah, that was
wonderful. That was so
really great.
Eric.
Yeah, really fun.
That was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And we had like a pretty good turnout.
No,
I
that
think.
was, yes,
Yeah.
that was very good. Yeah. And so just whenever works, just send me the recording. I can edit it and I'll get it up on YouTube and stuff.
Awesome.
And then, yes, as Pablo was saying, if there are people that couldn't make it, that registered, I can send them the link to the